Well, thank you to everyone joining us today for our lecture series, Unpacking Bedside Bioethics at the University of Minnesota Center for Bioethics. My name is Jennifer Needle Suarez. I'm one of the faculty members in the center, and I'm thrilled to be able to present our speaker today, Dr. Parent. What would you want? Navigating life, death, and organ donation when the heart stops. I am going to go through a little bit of housekeeping first before we introduce Mr. Parent. And just for note, for those joining from the University of Minnesota, we have a 24/7 consult service, and we are contracted to do consults for all inpatients in the mHealth Fairview system. You can reach us through Vocera. We will have the Q&A function open, so please put your questions in there. We will disable the chat function, but the recording of this will also be available on our webpage and through YouTube. We do have captions enabled for this, and there will be an evaluation available to you at the end of the session, and there will be three ways you can access it. First, it will pop up into the browser after the event. We will also send out a presentation details document in the chat that you can use to link to the evaluation, and you will get an email. And if you are looking for CEU credits, there will be a form in the presentation details document. And for University of Minnesota students seeking IPE credit, there will be a 15-minute post series discussion, and you will have to complete the reflection form. And you will be required to attend at least 75% of the webinar. So without further ado, I am really pleased to introduce Brendan Parent. I knew of him before I had the opportunity to work with him about a year ago on a paper. Brendan Parent is an associate professor in the Department of Population Health, as well as the Department of Surgery, and is the director of transplant ethics and policy research at the NYU Grossman School of Medicine. I could give many accolades to Mr. Parent here, but I will move along and allow Brendan to take charge of the talk today. Thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to hearing what you have to tell us about organ donation and when the heart stops beating.
Thank you so much, my colleague Jen and Dr. Needle Suarez, for having me here. This is really an honor, and I got to say, I think we all have something to learn from the Center for Bioethics, University of Minnesota, and how to throw a virtual party. This is really an extraordinary turnout, and I'm honored to be a part of it. I want to make sure that my slides are looking okay. Everything look right there, Jen? Or
they're good.
Okay.
Everything's good.
I also appreciate the questions that so many people submitted ahead of time. I wish we could get to all of them. If we don't talk about something that you really want to talk to me about, please do not hesitate to reach out after the conversation today, because we only have an hour. Here are my disclosures, and I'm not going to go through all of them. I tend to over-disclose because you are probably in a better position to decide what influences how I talk to you and why. But perhaps the most important part here is that the views I'm going to present today are my views, not the views of my institution or even necessarily anyone else in the entire universe. So here, actually, okay, one more bookmark. I'm going to ask Dr. Neil Suarez to cut me off at the right time so that we have enough time for questions. I'm going to do my best to stick to time, but if for whatever reason we're still going, please don't hesitate to interrupt me, throw a shoe, and say, let's get the conversation going, okay? So this is the fundamental dilemma in organ donation and transplant, which is that in order to save lives through organ transplant, someone has to die. And so how do we ensure the prioritization of the care of that patient and the rights of that patient over the recovery of their organs to save other people, right? We could potentially eliminate the organ shortage if we recover organs from all the people necessary to save all the people who need them. But clearly, we can't violate the rights of individuals who are walking around with organs just to save other people's lives. Right. So thank goodness we have some very clever philosophers who came up with something called the dead donor rule, which is ethics policy. It is not law. And various formulations of the dead donor rule have arisen, and I present two here. One is that organ donors have to be dead before you can recover their organs. Another formulation is that organ recovery itself must not cause the death of the donor. It just makes good sense, right? This is the wall that has been set up between the prioritization and care of the patient at the end of life and organ recovery motivations to preserve trust in medicine and trust in transplant. This means we need to know when death occurs in order to know when we are allowed to recover organs. So when does death occur? Well, traditionally, for hundreds, if not thousands of years, the way humans have determined whether someone was dead is if you don't have a pulse, right? When the heart stops, you are dead, and this is circulatory death. Now, this is a challenge for organ donation. Why? Well, because when circulation stops, the organs die, right? Without blood flowing through those organs, they will be no good to a transplant recipient. Hence, the evolution of organ donation, at least in this country, contingent on death by neurologic criteria, which is a relatively new concept and a very unique set of circumstances where a patient can be declared dead because they have zero brain function, permanent cessation of all neurologic function, but their other body systems, respiration and circulation, continue to perfuse organs inside the deceased donor's body, which helps with two things in organ donation. One, those organs remain viable for transplant. And two, we have more time to get authorization for organ donation to determine whether that person wanted to be a donor. So this is the way most organs have traditionally been recovered in this country. Now, the number that I present here has been going down. We'll talk about that in a moment. But how do most people die? Not by neurologic criteria. Most people die when their heart stops. So we have this mismatch between the way we recover most organs and the way that most organs are potentially available. Well, we still have any organ donation and transplant paper will always start with the same numbers, which is that at any given time in the United States alone, we have over 100,000 people on the wait list for an organ, and 17 people die each day. And really, this doesn't even scratch the surface of the number of people who are in organ failure and may never even make it to a wait list because we just don't have enough organs to treat all people who could potentially benefit. And one way that has been proposed to help alleviate this shortage is to recover more organs after circulatory death. And that proportion has been going up. I had a colleague make this graph for me, which shows the percentage of deceased donations that are after circulatory death. And that number has been creeping up significantly in recent years, almost 45%. But it means that there's still a ways to go to really capitalize on all of the potential there. But remember what I said, which is that we have a problem with organ donation after circulatory death, that those organs have been subject to warm ischemic time and are not necessarily as good for recipients. No blood flow, organs die, and if we don't have permission, no organs. So the timing is very sensitive and very challenging. So how do we recover more organs using this method in a way that is both ethical and technically feasible? And let's think about it in context of some changes sort of at the regulatory level, which is that the organ procurement organizations, OPOs, in this country are the organizations tasked with identifying potential donors, matching them with potential recipients, obtaining authorization, and facilitating that donation. Well, there have been many years where OPOs have been accused of not meeting sort of performance benchmarks, not recovering as many organs as they possibly could. And there are significant changes at the federal regulatory level, changing the conditions for coverage so that OPOs can be held more accountable. And these changes include new recovery metrics for how many organs they are expected to both recover and also transplant. And that these OPOs are now actually being graded against each other in a tiered system, such that if you fall below a certain threshold of recovered organs, you'll now either be warned or potentially decertified. And if you're decertified, then another OPO is going to have to assume your responsibilities and take over your donor service area. And so I put this on the table to think about the new pressures on OPOs to recover more organs and the kinds of incentives this might create in light of this challenge, which I mentioned, which is prioritizing the care of patient at the end of life while also trying to recover organs. And let's just bookmark that and think about it in context of what I'm going to discuss now, which is that there are a number of ethical challenges regarding DCD, right? It has to be a logistically complex, sophisticated, nuanced dance of various moments where we have the right authorization for various procedures, including withdrawing life-sustaining treatment, making sure that the timing of that comports with what the patient would have wanted, respect for the family's beliefs and values and concerns, and also the decision to donate organs, and then the actual implementation of organ recovery. So there's so many things we could talk about, but these are the three that I'm going to highlight today: reconciling these decisions, the donor care unit and how that is evolving, and normothermic regional perfusion. So let's start with reconciling end-of-life treatment decisions with organ donation decisions. The typical case here is a patient who has experienced irreversible and severe anoxic injury to the brain, is hospitalized, does not have capacity, and will not meet criteria for death by neurologic criteria. Okay, this patient will not progress to death by neurologic criteria. And either by virtue of an advance directive, a legal document, or a surrogate decision maker, we know that this patient would not have wanted to be maintained on life-sustaining treatment under these circumstances and wants to be allowed to die. Simultaneously, there is the possibility of organ donation, and quite possibly that this person is a first person authorized registered donor on their license, or their family knows that their loved one would have wanted to save other people's lives. What happens when the circumstances and the need for organ donation sort of logistics might require continuing life-sustaining treatment for some amount of time to make organ donation possible? Or to the contrary, what if we need to withdraw life-sustaining treatment on a particular schedule to make organ donation possible when Uncle Joe still needs to fly out from California to be able to say goodbye? How do we balance these simultaneous goals? And I'm not going to call them competing goals because they don't have to compete, but how do we balance them and reconcile them? And the Anatomical Gift Act of most states has a provision which says if there's an advance directive, the legal document, and first person authorization, another legal document, then it's the attending clinician who is supposed to confer with the prospective donor, and if that person doesn't have capacity, which they usually don't, with their authorized agent, to decide what to do under these circumstances. That's kind of complicated in itself because the attending clinician really isn't usually supposed to talk about organ donation. So how do we help clinicians through this decision-making process? How do we support patients? And more commonly, what if there's no advance directive, right? How many people in this room right now have an advance directive? And if we don't have an advance directive, what about sort of the average patient? And how many people have first person authorization, are a registered donor? More than half, but that still leaves hundreds of millions of people without organ donation explicitly indicated. So what do we do in these circumstances? Well, I'll give you an example through Minnesota's Anatomical Gift Act, which has a provision common to most anatomical gift acts in most states, which basically says that when a hospital refers a patient who could potentially be a donor to an OPO, while the OPO is doing its examination to determine whether this patient could be a donor, nothing can be done to interfere with the medical suitability of the parts for donation while the exam is ongoing. And so, under these circumstances, we might have to continue administering life-sustaining treatment. We might have to resuscitate, administer pressors, do these things that might contradict what the patient would have wanted if we are just thinking about end-of-life care in a vacuum in order to preserve the possibility to donate organs. Now, we're not talking a matter of months or weeks. We're talking a matter of hours, maybe days. But again, those hours and days could be complicated emotionally for the family and potentially for the clinical team as well. So how do we reconcile this provision, this sort of legal guidance, with surrogate healthcare decision-making frameworks? Now, every state has their own framework for how we make decisions for patients without capacity who have a terminal diagnosis with regard to life-sustaining treatment. But the bottom line is that those closest to the patient get to decide about withholding or withdrawing life-sustaining treatment based on what the patient would have wanted, and to the extent we don't know what the patient would have wanted, on their best interests. So this creates, I think, some important questions we need to answer, which include, under what circumstances should life-sustaining treatment be either prolonged to make organ donation possible or curtailed to make organ donation possible? How can we reconcile these goals? And how do we facilitate it in a way that honors the patient's values and also the family's interests? And speaking of the family, how can the hospital staff best support families during this process? And how can we avoid this tension in the first place? And I would posit this tension reinforcement cycle where we might have an erosion of trust between an organ procurement organization and a donor hospital by virtue of a long history. And if we have this concern in a hospital that the OPO might try to interfere or interject in the care process, the hospital might delay or even neglect to refer potential donors to the OPO. And if that happens, then the OPO is either late or absent to have this very important conversation with the donor family. And if that's the case, the hospital might then facilitate a withdrawal of life-sustaining treatment decision, which either undermines donation that the patient would have wanted, or might even delay withdrawal, which could cause distress for the family if they've already come to grips with this very challenging choice to say goodbye to their loved one. And then those circumstances further erodes the trust. So how can we break the cycle? And I think we need to think about all of the concomitant values and goals at play, which include the patient's care goals and their interests, the patient's values regarding donation, the family's interests, the clinical staff's interests, and even the potential transplant recipients. Now, I put that at the end because those concerns can never override or supersede these others, but we can't ignore those considerations. And instead of thinking about the patient's care goals and interests at odds with their values regarding donation and saying that we have two separate parties and completely separate institutions to manage these considerations, we have to link them. Because oftentimes a patient's values regarding donation are an important part of their care goals. Knowing that their legacy will contribute to the well-being and even saving the lives of others in the future can be an important part of their holistic care. And I'm going to put one more issue on the table or innovation on the table that plays right into this question about how we reconcile these goals. So a donor care unit is a relatively new concept, and it's either a specialized hospital or OPO unit dedicated to the care of organ donors before recovery. It is centralized, it has all the right resources and the right people to optimally manage donors and organ procurement to improve transplant outcomes. If the DCU is hospital-based, it can provide comfort care during withdrawal at the end of life, in addition to providing optimal circumstances for donation. Now, this is really the epitome of what might be considered an important breaking down of this wall between end of life care and organ donation so that we can best honor these goals at the same time and provide the best care on both sides of this fence. And there are circumstances where a patient can be transferred from their clinical care unit to a completely separate facility just for the purposes of optimizing organ donation while also ensuring that they have the best comfort care, ideally in a DCU. So how do we ensure that the attending clinicians and staff and OPO staff prepare and support families for what might be a challenging hospital DCU transfer? Families might not understand what's happening here. Why is my loved one moving from one unit to another to make organ donation possible? Why can't it happen here? Why can't I hold my loved one's hand in this room with my attending right here? Why does it have to change venues? And how do we ensure that the clinicians and staff in the DCU prioritize care of the incoming DCD patient while optimizing organ recovery? Now, I'll tell you, I know some of the people who manage these units, and they are extraordinary clinicians with compassion for their patients and recognize that these are patients first, organ donor second. But more often than not, these are not clinicians who have a long rapport with the family or with the patient. So what are the appropriate measures to ensure optimal comfort care? Who should be responsible for withdrawal of life-sustaining treatment and that comfort care? And what if that comfort care might hasten the death of the patient, not for purposes of donation, but really for comfort care, while understanding that this is taking place in a venue to optimize organ donation? And then finally, how do we prepare for when patients don't die in the allotted time to make organ donation possible, which happens, and then they have to be returned to the ICU? So I'm putting all of this on the table not to answer questions, but to remind ourselves that we have a number of important values and goals at stake that should inform how we talk to patients earlier on, ideally before they lose capacity, how we educate our clinical staff and prepare for the ethical future of organ donor management and patient care at the end of life. Clinical staff have generally been tasked with caring about the patient's care goals and interests, the family's interests and clinical staff, while the OPO has traditionally been tasked with caring about the patient values regarding donation and the transplant recipient interests. And this bifurcation, I believe, has led to that tension reinforcement cycle. And to break that cycle, I would challenge clinical staff and OPO staff to put each other in each other's shoes and recognize that these values need to be considered in concert with each other. Let's keep that in mind as we get into our final topic in this blitz. First I want to ask what you would want for end-of-life treatment. So now that we've had this conversation and perhaps you've been exposed to these kinds of circumstances, what would you want for end-of-life treatment and organ donation? Would you be okay being kept on the vent for a few extra hours, maybe even an extra day, if it meant saving other people's lives through organ donation or not? And how do you make your wishes known? Well, I'm going to give you some homework. If you haven't yet, go talk to your families. Talk to the people who are closest to you and tell them your values and what you would want. Make sure you know what they would want. And it's a hard conversation, but an important one. Advanced directives could evolve to have more specific options as DCD becomes a new phase of important recovery in organ donation. And I'm going to say something contentious here, maybe even include this on medical orders for life-sustaining treatment. More education earlier on in communities and schools. Let's get young people thinking about this. I believe that high schoolers have the capacity to think critically about their values and what they would want under these circumstances, and to understand the innovations in organ donation, body donation, tissue donation, and to be a part of this, right? To recognize that their contribution in the ethos of voluntarism means something. And then finally, again, another sort of potentially contentious posit here, that clinicians can talk to patients during goals of care conversations about organ donation, because organ donation can be a goal of care as long as it's done in a sensitive, thoughtful, and compassionate way. How are we looking on time? Okay. I do want to talk about, oh yeah, organ donation as a component of clinical care. There's your little animation. This is the extent of my PowerPoint game. I apologize. Let's talk for a moment about normothermic regional perfusion. Many of you might be familiar with this, some of you might not. What is NRP? And to make it even more complicated, we have all of these initials here. Thoracoabdominal normothermic regional perfusion in context of controlled donation after circulatory death. I'm just going to call it NRP for short. And so this is a method of organ recovery, of organ perfusion after circulatory death, where we have a patient who will not progress to death by neurologic criteria. A decision is made to withdraw life-sustaining treatment in accordance with their care goals. The patient also is a donor, or the family is representing that the patient would have wanted to donate. Treatment is withdrawn. The heart stops. Circulation stops. A declaration of death is made in accordance with accepted medical standards. And then, after that determination of death is made, blood flow to the brain is occluded either via ligation or clamping the aortic arch vessels, and then sometimes venting those vessels to atmospheric pressure so that no blood flow can reach the brain. When organs inside the donor's body are perfused regionally, either using a modified bypass or ECMO circuit, and then you can transport those organs after ensuring that damage has been mitigated from initial ischemic impact, and you can evaluate the quality of those organs under physiologic conditions. And guess what? This mode of organ preservation prior to DCD has really good outcomes. There are a lot of papers lauding the benefits of NRP for multiple different organs, and really sometimes on par with organs after death by neurologic criteria. So going back to the beginning of my presentation and saying, how do we overcome this challenge of DCD organs dying because the heart stops? Well, reperfuse them. Sounds great. Is this the answer? Well, for those of you who are just now wrangling with the topic of NRP, do you feel something strange about those steps I just listed? Does NRP undermine the determination of death of that donor if we are recirculating the organs inside the body, if we are occluding blood flow to the brain? So to answer that question, we need to know how to define death. And in the United States, an individual who has sustained either irreversible cessation of circulatory and respiratory functions or irreversible cessation of all function of the entire brain is dead. Okay, does NRP comport with this definition? Well, during NRP, we declare death because the heart stops, the breathing stops, and the heart will not resume by itself. Then blood flow to the brain is occluded, and then we restart circulation inside the donor's body. Does this undermine the definition? Can we say that restarting circulation comports with irreversible cessation? Well, we cannot, under any logical circumstances, say that death meets what's called the irreversibility standard. And what does that mean? In the definition, irreversibility really means circulation has stopped and it cannot be restarted. It is impossible to restart circulation. Well, no, we restarted it. So clearly it's not impossible to restart circulation. But now, wait a minute. If we require irreversible cessation of circulatory function whenever we declare death, regardless of organ donation, how often can we declare death? The answer is basically never, because technology has progressed to the point where we can always restart at least some amount of circulation. So really, we're violating the legal definition of death all the time when we are declaring death by circulatory criteria. Again, thank goodness for clever philosopher, scholar researchers who came up with a new standard and said, okay, well, when we say irreversible, what we really mean is permanent cessation of circulatory function. And permanent cessation means that circulation has stopped. It will not resume spontaneously, meaning the heart will not auto-resuscitate. And circulation will not be restarted, meaning we will make a choice not to restart circulation. So does NRP comport with this standard for circulatory death? And before we answer that question, I want to ask, is the cessation of circulatory function during NRP any less permanent than the cessation of circulation when we put any part of the circulatory system of that donor on an ex-situ device like TransMedics organ care system or any other device which will recirculate blood and potentially even the heart of the donor, get that circulation going again, or even direct rapid recovery and transplant into the recipient. When we transplant that heart into the recipient and it functions again. In all three of these DCD circumstances, we have restarted some amount of circulation. So does it matter whether it's inside the donor's body or not if we are strictly concerned with the legal definition of death? And then we have to ask, are we reanimating this patient? Are we violating the dead donor rule? Remember the dead donor rule talked about X number of slides ago? Either that the organ donor has to be dead before we get their organs, or that organ recovery must not cause the death of the donor. When we recirculate organs inside the donor's body, does it undermine the determination of death? And some say, yes, you restarted the circulation inside the donor's body, therefore you have undermined the determination of death. And if you undermine the determination of death and recover organs while that patient is still alive, the dead donor rule is violated. And that's an ethical problem, not just a legal problem. A response to that is, wait, no. You're not resuscitating this patient. The patient died in accordance with circulatory standards. You met all those benchmarks. After that moment, everything after is only perfusion for donation. Which argument do you buy? Many accuse this no answer of gerrymandering the definition of death and saying, wait a minute. You're talking about resuscitation now, but if you look at the legal definition of death, it doesn't say anything about resuscitation. It just says recirculation. So how are we making this jump to resuscitation? I would offer a clarified definition of circulatory death, which is that circulation has stopped. That's necessary. It will not resume spontaneously, meaning the heart will not start back up again on its own. That's essential. But then the traditional permanent definition says we will not restart circulation. This is how we declare death in medical practice all the time. But I think we need to ask, why not? Why are we choosing not to restart circulation? And the answer is because restoring any blood flow to the brain is not going to restore the patient, okay? This is implicit every time we make a determination of death by circulatory criteria, that if we try to restore circulation, it's not going to bring the patient back. And so when we say we will not restart circulation, what it really means is that we will not restore blood flow to the brain. Now, there's a very strong ethics presumption here, and that presumption is that all death is ultimately brain death. And not everybody is going to agree with this, okay? There are very significant groups of people who believe that if there is heart function, that patient is not dead. And we have to be respectful and thoughtful of these different points of view. But I'm going to ask you, here's a little philosophical hypothetical. Okay, let's go into the ether for a moment. And I'll ask, if you could live your life with only heart function and no brain function, or only brain function but no heart function, and you would be alive under either of these circumstances, which would you pick? And this comes to this question about where the locus of personhood is, right? Where do we reside inside this house that is our body? Okay, let's come back to Earth for a moment. Okay, fine. You might even allow that the brain is what matters, okay? And as long as there's no brain function, the patient isn't alive. But wait a minute. During NRP, who prevents blood flow to the brain? And the answer is the clinicians who are responsible for organ recovery and preservation and recovery. And so when the clinician prevents blood flow to the brain, aren't they causing death by neurologic criteria? And if they cause death by neurologic criteria, isn't that a problem? And you might respond saying, wait, no, the patient was already dead according to circulatory criteria. Remember, we met all those benchmarks, okay? So they were dead for purposes of organ preservation. And after they met that standard for death by circulatory criteria, there was additional time where the brain was getting no blood flow. And there are studies that suggest a critically ill patient who experiences an additional 4.5 minutes of anoxic injury to the brain will not be able to have brain function restored. So this meets the standard for permanent cessation of brain function. And then anything that happens after that moment is just organ perfusion, preservation for purposes of donation. Now, you might still ask, but okay, fine, but then why are you clamping if that brain is permanently ceased? And you might answer, well, just to be really sure, right? And the feeling here, the potential here is that preventing brain blood flow in this case ensures just the natural progression to death by neurologic criteria. We've already met sort of the standard for both circulatory criteria, brain function has ceased. And so what we're doing here is no ethically or legally different than withdrawing life-sustaining treatment. Now, many of you might remember a long history during which withdrawing life-sustaining treatment from a patient was not legal, right? Was akin to murder because you are facilitating the death of that patient. And it took a lot of jurisdictional wrangling and consensus building to decide that we are allowed to take a patient off of a ventilator because this is what the patient would have wanted, and that it's time to be allowed to die. The same way, potentially, that the patient wants to facilitate organ donation that would be optimal for recipients, that also respects their wishes to pass. Okay? These are the arguments. And I want to tell you, as an attorney, we need to forget the law for a moment and ask who's harmed and who's helped when we think about NRP. Well, clearly we need to think about the organ donor's family members. What are they being told or not told when NRP occurs? Should the family have any say or understanding of the heart restarting function after the donor's been declared dead, of occlusion of blood flow to the brain, of this question or concern about whether any blood might still reach the brain, even if we occlude blood flow, that we're not entirely sure there? What about the recipients? Yes, we need to think about the recipients and the potential benefits, but we can never think about the recipients in a vacuum and the benefits of these organs if we're doing anything wrong to the patient/donor. And so what about the donor? Well, as a registered donor, I want my organs to be good for the recipients. That's important. But I also don't want to feel anything during donation. I want to ensure no cerebral activity, no chance of discomfort. And so this is where the standardization of NRP protocol is essential. And currently, NRP is not standardized. It's being practiced in different ways at different institutions. And we want to make sure that we are observing rigorous protocol for ensuring the appropriate withdrawal of life-sustaining treatment, adequate palliative care during the patient's death process, proper and correct determination of death in accordance with accepted medical standards, the right kind of occlusion of blood flow to the brain, and then proper administration of NRP, et cetera. And there are studies, a few studies, that suggest if we do NRP correctly, there is not sufficient blood flow to the brain to mean anything. Now, these studies are few and far between. What you're looking at here, the headlines might even be a little misleading, and I'm even on a paper that says NRP does not restore brain blood flow. Well, it was 2 cases, okay? We have a total here of about maybe 6 to 8 people and a few pigs where we have shown this. So I'll ask for you, how many cases and what kind of cases will provide enough confidence that there is no blood flow restored to the brain during NRP for you to say, yeah, that's what I meant when I checked the box to be an organ donor? We need to answer these questions. And so what is informed authorization? This is my last slide, I think, Jen, so we can be prepared for questions. I will ask you, what does informed authorization for NRP mean? Would you agree to this, knowing what you know now, based on our conversation today and what you've seen out in practice, for yourself or for a family member? What information would you want to be told to make this decision, especially during a traumatic time? And maybe patients, their family members, they don't want to hear these things. It's really challenging for them to understand anything with the passing of their loved one. But what do we have to tell people to really make a decision in accordance with what their loved one would have wanted? And what do we want to make sure happens during the actual procedure? And I think a lot of this comes back to trust, and that we can trust that a decision for a patient to withdraw life-sustaining treatment is made correctly in accordance with accepted medical standards, and that 2 similarly situated patients who might come from very different socioeconomic backgrounds, and maybe one is insured and has family around and the other is underinsured and doesn't have family nearby because they're working, and that those patients aren't treated differently with regard to encouraging life-sustaining treatment withdrawal, and that one might be routed for organ donation and the other might not, right? On grounds that are not based on medical facts. So how can we be confident that these decisions are being made for patients in equitable ways and making sure that NRP is performed correctly? I will stop there and say thank you very much to everybody who listened through that laundry list of questions and issues, and look forward to the discussion.
Well, thank you so much. There are a lot of comments and questions, a number focused on your comment about considering adding organ donation preferences to an advance directive. A number of people are really interested in that concept, that idea, and are addressing it at their own institutions. But I'm wondering, do you have any examples or ways in which you think that can be thoughtfully advanced in an advance directive, given the conversations that arise during advanced care planning in general? Kind of a lot to take on in one goals of care conversation. So just curious your thoughts about that.
Yeah, devil's in the details, right? It's easy to sort of provide generally, what we should do, but the specifics are something that have to be worked out. And I would start with the simple one, which is, have the organ donation decision on advanced directives, but that doesn't solve the problem of informed authorization, right? But there are advanced directives that say nothing about organ donation. Okay, so once we get that on there, then we can break it down a little bit more and say, okay, well, if you want to be an organ donor, but there are circumstances that might require continuing life-sustaining treatment for a little while to make organ donation possible, would you be willing to allow for a reasonable amount of time to make organ donation possible, even if you want to withdraw, right? So that's a mouthful, but you can imagine a more sophisticated lawyer writing that in a way that people can understand and that will allow them to reconcile these challenging decisions. But then it gets even more complicated if you want to say, okay, well, what about NRP? Would you be cool with that, right? Yeah, goals of care conversations are already so packed with time and emotion, and you don't have time, clinicians. But you also know that goals of care conversations are not always one and done, right? So it could be a return to it on like the second visit. You can also gauge based on the particular family whether you think they would be receptive to the kind of conversation. So I think there can be education and training, but there needs to be, I think, some consensus building around how to do this effectively.
Well, and that leads to my next question is there were a number of people uh, asking about kind of how we message this appropriately to the public, to the community, because I think we're all coming to terms with the reality that our academic conversations about things are really quite valid, but don't necessarily translate into the way they're necessarily perceived in community. And just your thoughts about getting complex with an organ donation conversation that takes it to levels where we're talking about these sort of science fiction to many people types of procedures that we do, and where you think kind of the movement could go as far as messaging to help bring this more to public knowledge.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I would start with the sort of hopefully underlying theme through my presentation, which is trying to reconceptualize organ donation as a part of clinical care. Um, and that also means we need to be thinking more about clinical care, right? You might say, like, forget organ donation. We need to get people thinking about, end of life treatment and what they would want if they're in the hospital and don't have capacity. Yeah, 100%. That's the priority. And we can also build in these organ donation pieces. And when we talk about the sci-fi elements and how it's taken me years to wrap my brain around what happens during NRP, how do we communicate that with the public? Well, the same way we talk about very complicated clinical care topics. You put it in terms of patients' values, what actually matters to them, and you create a supported decision-making framework that is presented in plain language in accordance with health literacy and with the patient's values. So we're not going to say things like, ligating the aortic arch vessels and opening them up to atmospheric pressure. We're going to say, um, well, for this procedure, the heart might restart again, but your loved one is not going to wake up and interact with the world again, right? They've already lost that ability. And there are going to be things done to make sure that no blood flow reaches the brain, both to prevent, parts of the process of dying from affecting the organs for donation, but also to make sure that your loved one doesn't feel anything during this process. The same way we're going to make sure your loved one is comfortable after we withdraw life-sustaining treatment. How do you feel about that? Do you have any questions about what we're doing here? So that's just an example, again, off the top of my head, but there are people far more sophisticated at this, including the people who work at OPOs, have to have these very challenging, nuanced conversations all the time, and they're very good at it.
Well, there were, getting back to consent, first person authorization, a number of questions in the chat about what happens when a patient has given first person authorization for donation and the family objects. I think people are asking, one, from a legal standpoint, but two, also from a procedural standpoint of how we negotiate that.
Yeah, this is a big deal. From a legal standpoint, if a person is an authorized, a registered donor, family cannot override that organ donation decision. That is true in every state with an Anatomical Gift Act, with the new exception of Arkansas, where that law is changing and giving some power back to the family to override that choice. That's the law, right? And implicit in that law are all kinds of assumptions about what authorization means. And when someone registers to be a donor, generally they're just thinking, yeah, I won't need my organs after I'm gone, and how great would it be to save other people's lives? Most people don't really think about or know about the process of death and the different intricacies of that process, the innovations in organ donation, like NRP, like other preservation techniques, like different uses of the body, right? And so this is why for certain things, like for example, face transplant or hand transplant, what we call vascularized composite allograft, um, even though those are technically organs for purposes of donation, the expectation and policy is that we are going to get explicit authorization for these things that have unique moral valence. And I would argue that, at least currently, NRP fits that category. So we need sort of more explicit permission there. Now, how does that reconcile with first person authorization? Can we say that when you check the box, did you mean to include NRP? And I don't think we have the answer there yet. And we need, as a community, to decide whether that fits the I checked the box and that's what I meant, or we need to give some additional power, knowing that that's not necessarily part of FPA.
Great, thank you. A couple of questions asking about NRP in pediatrics, and if you can address the state of medicine right now with regard to pediatrics, and anything that's particularly different in that population.
I'll ask you to jump in there with me too, right? So Dr. Neil Suarez and I have thought through this, for the ethics section of a recent paper looking at NRP in the pediatric population. And I'll start by saying the concerns remain. Everything we just talked about, I think, is true in the pediatric context. And we have the additional ethical considerations that children can't consent, right? You're never going to have a registered donor in that case. And so, how are families making this decision? Is it based on their own values or what their loved one would have wanted? Their 3-year-old, their 5-year-old, their 12-year-old. It's going to be very different for very young children versus versus older children, and potentially some important biological clinical considerations about brain function, right? And what it means to occlude blood flow to this brain, and decisions, again, that it is appropriate to withdraw life-sustaining treatment from this patient because there is no hope of meaningful recovery. So, it's not a satisfying answer except to say that the concerns remain and potentially are magnified. And would you want to add anything to that, Jen?
Just to answer, a number of people were asking if it's done, and there are centers that do. Most centers do DCD in pediatrics, but a number of centers now do NRP DCD in pediatrics. So
that's right. Yeah, and for every center that has, is starting up NRP either in the pediatric or adult context, there's probably another center that's still trying to think through these ethical questions, how we communicate with families, what the actual protocol should look like, what patients are appropriate for this procedure. So we are at sort of a critical sort of lightning rod moment and point of figuring it out. And yes, the pediatric context is a very important one.
I really liked your tension reinforcement cycle slide about kind of the relationship between hospitals and OPOs. And there was a fair amount of discussion in the chat with people that reflected that there is that tension, that there's certainly a sense that the OPOs are over-involved or involved at the wrong time. And I'm just curious your thoughts about ways to sort of reduce the conflict at baseline if we're talking about now advancing to more complex types of organ recovery. Certainly the relationship needs to be strong to coordinate that care. And, obviously in donor units, that's probably a much more healthy marriage. But in community hospitals or smaller hospitals where there isn't that constant relationship building, things you've seen in other places that have really helped OPOs and teams come together in this process?
Yeah, that's a great one. And honestly, I'm going to get back to basics here, right? And say that some good old-fashioned listening sessions make a difference, right? I think this culture of conflict and tension has created almost again, like a adversarial system where, both sides are thinking, yeah, we got to hold our ground and make this happen regardless of what, how we're perceived and received. And I think not only does that reinforce this tension between these entities, but there are ripple effects, right? And so the family members of the attending clinicians and the nurses who feel overrun by OPO representatives, because the OPO representatives, again, to their credit, are are trained to manifest the honorable decision of the donor. And then if those clinicians and nurses feel betrayed or abused, they might go and retract their designations and talk to their loved ones and say, guess what's happening at the hospital? You should also remove your donor designation. And then the family members do the same thing and go into their communities. And so this adversarial system, what do we do about it? The places where I've seen success are where the OPOs go and have dedicated time to sit down with the clinical teams, the ICU staff, with the chief medical officer, and just listen. Ask what they are seeing, what they are feeling, hear the concerns, and come to agreements about how to operate that might not even be in the sort of contractual policy agreement, but are going to be new standards for how and when the OPO is going to be able to come into the ICU, right? Where they're going to stand. Are they waiting at the nursing station, ready to jump, or are they going to be outside and wait to, be told to come in? So making these kinds of explicit promises and agreements, really understanding again that organ donation can be a part of clinical care, but that clinical care for end-of-life treatment takes priority. Can be done through mediation and willingness to get over this challenge, this adversarial sort of baseline. And
Thank
sorry,
you.
last thing I'll say is the places where I've seen that happen have vastly improved the referral rates, improved the conversations, the timing. And when I go into those systems and I say, okay, so how are things happening? How are you handling these conflicts? A lot of them say, yeah, we're good, actually. We love the OPO representative coming in because we just spent 2 weeks, talking to each other and figuring this out.
A number of questions, which you may or may not be able to answer, but the financial element of NRP. A number of people have asked, who pays for it? Is it different than a DCD donor or a brain dead donor? Can you address that question?
Yeah, I can't talk. I don't have the expertise to say who is actually paying for these things because it's complicated, right? There's like the sort of frontline payer, but then who actually ends up footing the bill. What I can say is that um, for every DCD case where we could potentially use an XC2 machine, a device that perfuses organs outside the body, which is an incredible solution. And a lot of people say, hey, just do that instead of NRP. You avoid all the ethical issues. Yes, but those machines are fewer and further between. They are challenging to run. They need specialists. And for example, a single instance of heart recovery using an XC2 perfusion device can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. A single instance of NRP can cost about $5,000. So it will be significantly cheaper also than doing a recovery after death by neurologic criteria and outside the body perfusion. And while money does not equate to ethics or ethical, we could potentially recover significantly more organs if we do NRP than choosing between that and XC2 perfusion. Okay, I'm sorry.
Great.
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. And someone put in the chat that the cost for DCD with machine perfusion is about 80 to 120,000 versus about 10,000 for NRP. So I assume people on this webinar have knowledge of the cost. So thank you for addressing that. That was a number of people's questions. I cannot thank you enough for a really wonderful talk highlighting the key ethical issues here and the issues in donation. There are a lot of things in the chat that reflect that people found this incredibly helpful and really will actually take it back to their centers, some of the things they learned today. So thank you so much for the talk. And just for those on the call, I want to share that we will have Dr. Tyler Tate for our next Unpacking Bedside Bioethics to talk about suffering and the role of medicine in responding to suffering. And last piece of information is that we have 3 classes coming in the fall for people who are at the University of Minnesota, and you can see them listed here. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending, and thank you, Brendan, for a really fantastic talk. Much appreciated.